Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Today we have interpretation services available in English, Arabic, and Spanish. Please choose the language you prefer by clicking on the little icon that appears at the bottom of your screens. We encourage you all to send your questions or comments to the speakers by using the Q&A Zoom tab. I'm Ana Lucia Jacome, Senior Project Leader at the Division for People and Social Inclusion at UNITAR. I coordinate the development of training tools focused on anti-corruption. I remain at your disposal in case you want to explore possible synergies. For the welcome remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Firas Al-Haditi, Executive Director of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, GOPAC. He started his career as diplomat and later worked as the director of the International Cooperation Department in the Public Prosecution of the State of Qatar. He has been a focal point with many international agencies regarding a number of different sectoral projects, including the organization of one of the conferences of the state parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption and the Arab Forum on Asset Recovery. Dr. Firas, please, the floor is yours.
جزيلا أليكس على مساهمتك، وشكرا على الكلمة الطيبة التي قلتها في شخصي. أشكركم أيضا جميعا. يشرفني أن أتحدث في حضوركم اليوم، ولقد بنينا كما تعلمون شراكة حقيقية بحيث أن يونيتار لم يتوانى عن دعم منظمة خدمة للهدف النبيل الذي هو مكافحة الفساد. إن سمحتم لي سأتحدث باللغة العربية، فقد كتبت كلمتي بهذه اللغة.
بين هذا العدد الكبير من الزملاء الذين نتقاسم وإياهم ذات التوجهات الساعية إلى تكريس المسؤولية البرلمانية والحوكمة الرشيدة المستندة على أسس التعاون في سبيل تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة وتكريس العمل بمبادئ الحوكمة الرشيدة سعياً للحفاظ على المعمورة. إن التحول المناخي الذي نشهده اليوم يتطلب حلولاً معقدة على مختلف المستويات ويرتبط بجميع شرائح المجتمع ومختلف القطاعات، وما كانت التنمية المستدامة إلا استجابة فعلية لهذا التحدي. إن رفاهية الشعوب ورفاهية كوكب الأرض والطبيعة يجب أن لا تكون متقاطعة، وهنا برزت التدابير التي نستخدمها اليوم مثل الحوكمة لضمان أن تكون التنمية رديف لحماية البيئة من خلال إنشاء آليات تتكيف مع سياقات محددة وطائفة واسعة من المواضيع. لا أبالغ بالقول هنا أن المشاركة في صنع القرار البيئي والمناخي حق من حقوق الإنسان وعلى مختلف الجهات ومن بينها التشريعية، فالعمل على ضمان هذا الحق سواء من خلال الحصول على المعلومات البيئية أو العدالة المناخية أو مشاركة وحماية المدافعين عن القضايا المتعلقة بالمناخ أو التوعية بقضايا المناخ، كل هذه أمور مهمة جدا يجب علينا العمل معا من أجل تحقيقها. ويمكن لنا كمجتمع مدني أو منظمات حكومية أو غير حكومية أو كعاملين في التشريع أن نقوم بذلك لا يمكن أن نقوم بذلك بدون شراكات واضحة وقوية مع القطاعات الأخرى، سواء كانت أكاديمية أو خاصة أو حكومية أو مختلف القطاعات المتنوعة التي نراها في المجتمع اليوم. على المستوى الدولي قطعت منظمة الأمم المتحدة وبدعم من مختلف الدول خطوات كبيرة في مجال السعي للتوعية بخطورة تحدي المناخ من جهة، ومن جهة إنشاء آليات دولية ناجعة للتعامل مع هذه الظاهرة الكونية، وأبرزها مؤتمر الدول الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن تغير المناخ، ناهيك عن الأجهزة الفعالة في هذا المجال مثل برنامج الأمم المتحدة للبيئة وبرنامج الأمم الإنمائي، وبالطبع لا يفوتني أن أذكر هنا معهد الأمم المتحدة للبحث والتدريب. ولا يفوتني هنا إلا أن أتوجه بالشكر والتقدير إلى سعادة السيد نيكولسيث مدير المعهد، وأخي وصديقي سعادة الدكتور أليكس ميخيا على دعمهما المستمرين لهذه الجهود سواء كانت من خلال منظمة برلمانيين ضد الفساد أو من خلال العمل الدولي الدؤوب سواء كان أكاديميا أو على الأرض. نحن كمنظمات غير حكومية نتحمل مسؤولية كبيرة بما تسمح لنا مساحة طبيعة عملنا، إذ لا نتقيد بالقيود التي تصاحب الوفود الرسمية للدول ولا مجموع الإيرادات التي تشكل المنظمات الدولية الحكومية. تسعى منظمتنا إلى مكافحة الفساد بشتى أشكاله، ومن بين ذلك الفساد الذي يتعرض له هذا الكوكب الأزرق بسبب التلوث وسوء استخدام الموارد والإفراط في الإنتاج وما إلى ذلك من قضايا عالمية تؤدي اليوم إلى تغير واضح للمناخ. ولن نتمكن من تحقيق نتائج دون شراكات وطنية وإقليمية ودولية، واجتماعنا اليوم هو خير دليل على ذلك. إن سعينا المستمر كمنظمة برلمانيين ضد الفساد ليكون للمشرعين صوت مسموع في أروقة الاتفاقيات الدولية مثل مؤتمر الدول الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الفساد، يجب أن يوازيه سعي موازي في الاتفاقيات الدولية الأخرى كمؤتمر الدول الأطراف في اتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن تغير المناخ، فهو الآخر نوع من أنواع الفساد الذي قد نتفق اليوم على أنه من أكبر التحديات التي تواجه الإنسانية اليوم إن لم يكن أكبرها. أود أن أكرر شكري لجميع الذين قبلوا أن يشاركون الحديث اليوم من زملاء أقدر لهم سعيهم والتزامهم بهذه القضية السامية، كما أشكر جميع الذين يشاركون في هذا الاجتماع وأتطلع للاستفادة منكم جميعا. ولا يفوتني أيضا أن أشكر زملائي المنظمين من معهد الأمم المتحدة للبحث والتدريب في جنيف على هذه الشراكة التي نسعى إلى قطف ثمارها من خلال الاستفادة من الأفكار القيمة التي سنستمع إليها اليوم والتي سنستمر في السماع عليها من خلال نشاطاتكم التي لا غنى عنها. شكرا جزيلا وأتطلع إلى مناقشاتكم.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fira.
Now, it's a pleasure to share with you a welcome video message from Mr. Nikhil Seth, UN Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of UNITAR since June 2015. During his long career with the UN since 1993, he has served from different positions, including as the Director for the Division of Sustainable Development at UNDESA in New York, Special Assistant and Chief of Office to the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Chief of the Policy Coordination Branch in the Division for ECOSOC Support and Coordination. Before joining the UN Secretariat, he was diplomat for India since 1980. Please, Andrea, play the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all to the virtual roundtable entitled Parliamentary Accountability and Good Governance for Climate Change. The interlinkages between climate change and corruption are not very evident, but both trigger serious impacts on human rights, development, peace, and security. Although ongoing discussions and actions on both topics takes place in different contexts and fora at local, regional, and international level, their connection is barely discussed. On the one hand, corruption undermines efforts to address climate change by diverting resources, distorting laws and policies, as well as impeding the implementation of sustainable practices. On the other hand, the consequences of climate change, such as extreme weather events and resource scarcity, can create conditions in which corruption thrives, further exacerbating environmental degradation and hampering effective responses. The ongoing discussions and steps around these instruments can encompass the interlinkages between combating corruption and climate change. Furthermore, significant actions of different stakeholders are required, including through the enhancement or adoption of laws and public budget, existence of effective mechanisms, policies, programs, as well as other initiatives towards better societies for all. In this regard, parliaments play a crucial role through the oversight of governments and the implementation of recommendations coming from the ratification of international treaties. It is a pleasure for UNITAR to join efforts with the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, GOPAC, to celebrate this event. It is envisaged as an opportunity for raising awareness and empowering parliaments and related advisors as well as other relevant stakeholders on the challenges and opportunities coming from combating corruption and climate change. I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Let me warmly welcome our first speaker, Dr. Walter Schultz. He's alternate board member developing country parties from the Latin American and the Caribbean states Green Climate Fund, as well as former vice president of the Bureau of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, and chair of the G77 for Climate Change. He's an Ecuadorian diplomat with 26 years of experience, serving twice as the director of Environmental and Sustainable Development Division, also at the permanent missions to the UN in New York and Geneva, respectively, and acting for more than 10 years as chief negotiator in different multilateral processes on sustainable development, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, among others. Please, Dr. Schultz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ana Lucia, and allow me to greatly thank UNITAR and GOPAC, our dear friend Alex and Mikel, and of course Dr. Firas for the kind invitation. I think we have this event is a great opportunity to share some ideas of such relevance, that interlinkage that has been mentioned, that not necessarily is addressed, and also the role that parliaments can play in as law and policy makers at all levels in that regard. To start, one of the approaches that has been suggested to address that linkages is the analysis of the risk of conflict of interest and capture or corporate capture in the processes of negotiation and implementation of action and support under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. This is an issue where I personally have been involved in the past, but I can bring you a little bit backwards as well into the Rio Convention itself in 1992, as you all know, which includes provisions that promote or call to parties to promote and incorporate in education, training, and public awareness, and also to encourage the widest participation in the process, and including, of course, non-governmental organizations. As well, the COP of the parties in the convention is also has among its functions to seek and utilize services and cooperation of different competent international organizations and also intergovernmental and non-governmental bodies. And also has a mandate to develop specific rules of procedure for the admission or participation of observers. However, all those messages at that time were addressed mainly to the states. Only even the call for cooperation in wider terms were mainly addressed to the states. I mean, we had to wait all the way until the Paris Agreement in 2015, where there was this significant shift that the targets or addressees of the calls for climate action was also addressed to other non-state actors, particularly in mitigation and on finance. In the Paris Agreement, even in the preamble itself, there is a recognition of the importance of engagement of all levels of government, but also different actors. Article 6, which is the famous Article 6 of different mechanisms of market and non-market, has as one of the objectives of that mechanism to incentivize and facilitate the participation of public and private entities authorized by a party. And even in the non-market mechanism or approach, when it is defined in the Paris Agreement, it also said that it should aim to enhance public and private sector participation in implementation of NDCs. Also, in the decision by which the Paris Agreement was adopted, 1CP21 in 2015 as well, there is a final section that is called non-party stakeholders. And it has 4 provisions that welcome and encourage the participation of different stakeholders and invite those actors, to scale up their efforts and support mitigation and adaptation actions. Since then, there's been a number of initiatives, platforms, action agendas, the creation of climate champions as well, And the number, only the number, if you look at the number of observers that participate in the COPs, you can see that they went from, just to give you examples, 13,000, so 1,300 observers in COP 15 to more than 2,000 in COP 21, so in 2015, all the way until 80,000 in the COP 28, the last COP in Dubai, 80,000 observers, only observers. So if you add that, the state delegates, you went over 100,000. For such admission, the Secretariat has different instruments that go, that differentiate even between the organizations, either if they represent business and industry, women, environment organizations, gender, farmers, youth, local governments, and academia. And it has also guidelines and principles for the cooperation with the private sector. Nevertheless, one of the criticisms or observation to that is that those instruments have been developed by the Secretariat. They have not been intergovernmentally negotiated. So, and also that they address the issue in silos, but not in one comprehensive instruments or policy, and that they do facilitate the engagement. So that's, which is of course something that is open and is coming from the Paris Agreement, but they don't create correspondent or parallel obligations to address, for instance, a potential conflict of interest or undue influence, or to address situations of corruption and so on. That's why during the first years after the Paris Agreement entered into force, some countries, group of countries, including Ecuador, we presented some proposals aiming to unifying and strengthening those provisions with a view just to protect the process from such risks. Those proposals did not succeed, I have to be honest, after very much 2 years of attempts, but it did create and brought to the table that debate at the COPs and in some subsidiary bodies meetings, and it triggered a number of submissions from different stakeholders, which included suggestions to use different models that they are there. For instance, one of those was the framework for the engagement of non-state actors, the FENSA, from the WHO, the Convention of Tobacco Control, or policies that are there and under the OCDE or UNICEF, or legislation also adopted in different countries. Some of those frameworks, they are clear recognitions of the benefits of the participation of non-state actors, but also they include rules on due diligence, risk assessment and management, transparency and accountability. That is why I believe that especially in the current context, where we have already not only the Paris Agreement, but the mechanisms of Article 6 fully fleshed and that developed and agreed and then ready to become operational, is more than ever important and relevant to adopt a mandate to start a negotiation of a comprehensive framework of accountability and conflict of interest. Parliaments can also play a key role in that regard in those efforts, either through, as Alex was mentioning, their different capacities, because they have the capacity to oversee the government actions to implement the international obligations and commitments, but also they have the capacity to develop themselves norms that strengthen that transparency, due diligence, accountability of that engagement of non-state actors. As an example, the European Parliament in 2017 adopted a resolution that urged the European Union and its member states to promote the contribution of non-state actors in the fight against climate change, but also call their attention on the need to address the issue of conflict of interest through guidelines and procedures. That's why I think, in spite of the different positions and assessments of the result of the last COP, the result, the main result, which was the global stocktake and the UAE consensus, included a number of commitments that are really able to mark a change, which, as you know, there was a commitment on calls on the deep, rapid, and sustained reductions on global GHG emissions, tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, phasing down coal power, accelerating efforts towards net zero, and so on. All of that, those commitments, even though they're global, they do require national implementation, and they do require, in some cases, legal reforms, policy reforms, tax reforms, and many of those have to go, in the large majority of cases of countries, through parliaments as well. So their role is on the implementation of such a key next phases of the climate action, global climate action, is fundamental. Other avenues for enhancing transparency and accountability in the fight against climate change can also be found in the specific policies of different funds. And I speak in the case that I'm involved or participate in the Climate Fund, because they do have policies or mechanisms that include accountability, managed risk, and evaluation of performance. They have an independent evaluation unit, an independent integrity unit, which investigates allegations of fraud, corruption, misconduct, and other practices, including coercive and collusive practices. They also address conflict of interest and even retaliation against whistleblowers. Another feature important of this independent unit is that they not only react, but they can take actions on the prevention side. And also they can promote awareness of GCF's integrity standards. There is, on the top of those two, there is a third one, which is an independent redress mechanism. So when there is already a negative effect, any person or group of persons can also file a request to that mechanism, explaining that requesting a reconsideration of a funding proposal due, for example, to a community displacement or resettlement, human rights violations, corruption, food security, and so on. Finally, at the national level, we also have a national strategy on climate finance that I can share with you, that is public on the website. We adopted it in 2021 in Ecuador, and which includes, among its principles, transparency, access to information, accountability, as well as a co-responsibility between the state and all relevant public and private entities in the effective implementation of climate action and climate finance in particular. Among the objectives of that policy, I just would like to highlight that it says there, the facilitation of an adequate flow of information, knowledge of climate finance between what is needed and what is offered or available at the national, international level. But also, the other main objective is to ensure the accountability and transparency of the use of those resources, which is also always a claim from donor countries through mechanisms of monitoring, reporting, and verification. We have other experiences on debt that I think we have had good experiences, but I think also could be mainstream or developed more largely. At the regional level, we have the Escazú agreement, also, which provides that, as Dr. Frias was mentioning, the right to information and the decision making. And also we have other processes related to more directly to corruption, such as illicit financial flows, that also could be linked to these efforts. So those would be the thoughts or ideas that I suggest, and the experience that we have made in the past, not necessarily with a successful conclusion, but I think we can certainly resume with initiatives such as this dialogue, and I encourage UNITAR and GOPAC to resume this effort as well, and for which Ecuador is ready to support as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schultz, for stressing on the importance of strengthening efforts in the international arena towards impactful solutions. The examples of the mechanisms that you have shared are quite inspiring, and of course, there is a lot to do, but there are significant steps that have been done so far. You are more than welcome to join us in these efforts. To continue with, we are lucky to have with us today Dr. Michael Nest. He's an independent expert who has worked on governance, accountability, and transparency issues for 25 years, including as a policy researcher and as anti-corruption practitioner. Much of his work has focused on the exploitation of natural resources and on integrity risks related to climate finance. He is the award-winning author of 5 books which include themes of corruption, crime, and natural resources. His clients include Transparency International, the International Court of Justice, U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center, OECD, and UNDP. Please, Dr. Nest, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ana Lucia, and Dr. El Haditi, also my co-speakers, and Alex Mejia. I appreciate this opportunity to speak. So as indicated, my presentation today is about Transparency International's Case Atlas of Corruption and Climate, launched earlier this year. And you just saw an image of the cover on the screen, and the document is available online. I was the main author of the document, which is based on an online atlas of cases of corruption in climate initiatives, where those initiatives are largely funded by climate finance, as well as in the atlas includes some cases of mismanagement and corruption in environmental resource management generally. The atlas is not a definitive list. It is ever-growing and dynamic, with cases being constantly added. But to go back a step and to give you some background to climate finance, in 2022, climate finance reached $1.3 trillion US. This amount is almost exactly half from public sources and half from private sources. Within that amount, there is a subset of climate-related development finance, as counted and detailed by the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, and that is roughly $100 million. So it's around 7.8% of total climate finance. To be effective, climate finance needs to be used for its intended purposes, as we know. The risk is that fraud and corruption will undermine climate goals by reducing the money available, by making any outcomes suboptimal, that is, they won't achieve the best possible outcomes, whether focused on mitigation or adaptation, and by undermining confidence in climate initiatives, because the public will think these initiatives are full of corruption and therefore there is no point doing anything, and we just have to accept that climate change is going to occur. So Transparency International's atlas contains approximately 80 cases from 49 jurisdictions from all geographic regions. Based on case analysis, it makes 17 recommendations to governments, civil society, donors, multilateral organizations, and to business. 12 types of corrupt behaviors were identified, the most common acts being fraud, undue influence, undeclared conflicts of interest, collusion, and bribery. The atlas lists 16 enabling factors that allowed these corrupt behaviors to occur. Because of the small data set, there's only about 80 cases, it is not yet possible to say which enabling factors should be the priorities to address, but with time, as the atlas grows, we will be better able to identify priorities. Enabling factors include things like, within an institution, organizational culture, corruption not being a priority for senior management, weak financial processes or weak procurement processes, inadequate due diligence on contractors, and inadequate stakeholder engagement. But as I mentioned, there are 16 enabling factors mentioned. These are only some of them. So when we come to question time, I'm happy to answer questions about the details of the atlas, but the processes of researching and writing the report raise 3 important topics about corruption and climate finance, which I'd like to talk about today. First, although cases in the atlas are from all geographic areas, most cases are from the US and Europe. This is because of greater transparency around reporting corruption and a free media. So information was available about the corruption that occurred. So for the record, I don't think corruption in climate finance is more prevalent in the global north. I think we're just more likely to hear about it. But information about case studies is critical for us to learn about how corruption in climate finance occurs and how to stop it. UNITAR Executive Director Nikhil Seth mentioned in his opening address that the link between corruption and climate change is not obvious, and he's right. Good case studies, however, can make this link obvious, and this is why they are so important. So in particular, we need information about what laws were broken and what charges were laid against the perpetrators. This information helps with law reform and educating both investigators, prosecutors, and lawmakers. We also need to know how the corruption that was detected or identified undermined climate action. Were greenhouse gases not reduced, or were they even increased because of the corruption? I've seen case studies of both. Was adaptation infrastructure made to inferior standards? Were resources such as water less well managed than before because of the corruption that occurred in the project? This information about both laws that were broken and perpetrators, and then the damage in terms of the climate, generates the link between corruption and its negative impacts. It helps climate scientists understand why anti-corruption work is important, and it helps anti-corruption practitioners communicate why watching the money matters, as well as helps lawmakers and the public understand these relationships. For the members of GOPAC and other parliamentarians listening, you can help get this kind of information released, and it is critical for primary research to create these links and develop this understanding between corruption and climate change. The second issue I wanted to adopt regards undue influence, or lobbying, if you prefer this term. So this issue links with Walter Schultz's words earlier about the risks of capture, especially by corporate interests. In particular, cases of undue influence were reported at all the UNFCCC's conferences of the parties, including most recently the one COP28 in Dubai. Undue influence perverts the energy transition. It slows the phasing out of fossil fuels, delays the construction of renewable energy networks, causes community interests to be ignored, and it directs subsidies towards wealthy corporations. Undue influence or lobbying is an interesting phenomenon, however. Transparency International does consider it to be corruption, but there are mixed views. And part of the disagreement around undue influence is that there are frequently no specific laws against it. So it can be very difficult to regulate, and it can be almost impossible to lay charges or actually prosecute anybody. In democracies and some other countries with different regime types, lobbying is definitely seen to have a role, because lawmakers and policymakers, such as parliamentarians, want to be able to meet many people to understand different perspectives on an issue, and this is reasonable. Different stakeholders also want to lobby. They want to explain their interests and ideas. But the two key problems with undue influence are these. First of all, it is done in secret. There is no transparency and no one knows what is going on. The second problem is the inequality that occurs in much of lobbying. Individuals or organizations with lots of money get to influence policy and laws for their own benefit, and the public interest, the public good, gets crowded out or not heard or forgotten. Businesses that cannot afford to buy access also miss out. And the third topic that I wanted to talk about is this. Although climate change is a global phenomenon, climate finance is not global. Climate finance does not just go to reducing greenhouse gases in the countries that generate the most emissions in terms of mitigation, nor to the countries with the greatest adaptation needs, nor to the poorest countries. Climate finance is a market, and jurisdictions compete with each other to get a piece of the climate finance pie. But there are two interesting and divergent trends around jurisdictions with high rates of corruption. First of all, countries that have weak control of corruption will miss out on climate finance. I'm currently doing a project on corruption and climate finance in the Middle East and North Africa region. And there are huge needs for adaptation projects due to the impact of climate change on this region. However, the region receives only 1.4% of all climate finance, the lowest of any geographic region. On the whole, Middle Eastern and North African states do poorly on control of corruption. Most states rank below the global average on indices such as Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the World Bank's Control of Corruption Index, or the T Index for transparency. These states will not receive climate finance they require unless they can better control corruption. Climate finance investments will go elsewhere. Having said that, some donors will always have specific dedicated tranches of money for some countries, and that money will probably continue to flow, including, for example, for adaptation projects. But on the whole, in terms of competition globally to attract climate investments, I think countries that do poorly on control of corruption will not be very successful. The second trend involves a subset of states. So I mentioned there were two divergent trends. The second trend involves a subset of states with weak control of corruption that will continue to receive climate finance, possibly even more climate finance. And this is because they produce critical minerals that are essential for the energy transition. I'm thinking, for example, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, Indonesia, Philippines, Peru, Argentina, and Brazil. Some of these countries do okay on transparency if you actually look at the indices, but none of them do very well on control of corruption. As many of you will know, the United States, the European Union, and Japan all have initiatives to restructure their global supply chains for critical minerals in order to reduce their dependence on China and Russia. So these minerals are essential for any kind of energy transition in terms of renewable and green energy. So this means that producers of critical minerals are likely to continue to receive climate finance investments from the global north, notwithstanding their corruption, because the global north and China wants their minerals. All of this is to say that how climate finance is allocated is not determined solely by how many emissions a country produces, nor by a country's adaptation needs. Politics in the way corruption is addressed or ignored is also involved. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ness, for highlighting several important aspects. If I may, what you have said about lobbying. Indeed, there are a few countries that have a specific regulation for lobbying in the work of parliamentarians, because there are many people who work advising parliaments and also in other decision-making processes. But it's important to have clear rules that help this work to do it, but in a transparent manner. So we warmly invite all the attendees today to explore the publication of Dr. Ness with Transparency International. We will be sharing the link of the publication through the chat box. Now, to continue, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Julio Andrade, Deputy Director of the International Training Centers for Authorities and Leaders, CIFAL Global Network. He has served at the Spanish local government of Malaga for several years, including as Vice President for Citizens' Participation, Good Governance, and Security. He is visiting professor at the Shanghai University of Political Science and Law, as well as the Director General of the International Foundation for Sustainable Development and Security Coordinator of Malaga at the Spanish UN Security Department. Please, Dr. Andrade, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ana Lucia. Thanks for the invitation to GOPAC, Dr. Firas, Alex, and all the panelists, and mainly the participants that are here. Thank you very much to all of you. It's my pleasure to share a case, a use case of some of the projects that we are delivering in UNITAR. And I'm going to talk specifically about one project that the office in Malaga, CIFAL Malaga, was partnering with Amazon, the multinational company, and with the government of the region. Well, I always, anytime that I talk, I like to share, first of all, that CIFAL Malaga and the city where I was born and where I live most of my time, where I'm not traveling on mission. And here just to share with you a beautiful area of the Mediterranean. And next, please. Well, we in this project, we are talking about youth empowerment. So we're talking about sustainable development and collaborative leadership, because we believe that the leadership will come from these young people that together with the implementing partners, with the experts, with the NGOs, will come to understand better how to fight climate change, how to fight climate change on the ground, but with an expertise, a previous expertise through training. Next, please. This project is called Green Helmets, or Cascos Verdes, and it's been run by UNITAR, as I was saying, by the center in Malaga, but now we are scaling up this project through UNITAR to other international training centers, to other CIFAL centers. Next, please. Next, please. Well, this is a project inspired by the UN Blue Helmets, which aims to open an opportunity, a space to to gather all these thousands of students that want to stand up and for the planet's sustainability, and also to build new bridges between projects, environments, students, governments. So this is a multidisciplinary project that I'd like to share with the participants that could be replicated in other places of the world with the support of companies like Amazon, but also with the support to the Climate Pledge Fund, where many other companies in the world with the support of governments and civil centers, of course. Next, please. Next, please. Well, here you can see that in this project, mainly many other small organizations have been participating. Of course, when we deliver projects in different cities, the municipalities are involved, important NGOs are involved, other partners that give a specific material for the project, because at the end we are talking that we want to build a leader, future leaders. So of course we try them to understand better, that climate change is the cause of many human problems in the world, and how the planet is warming, how this initiative is to support and should have a last impact. And because if it's for reforestation, the trees will remain there. It is collecting waste. We are better preparing the rivers of the ocean. If it's to train or to understand better, we are giving them the importance of fighting against the planet as individuals. And of course, so we are involving youth, local communities, local government, and companies. Next, please. So the project has three main objectives. The first thing, the first pillar was training. So we planned and did train 9,000 students in the Andalusian region between ages 11 and 18 through the virtual classroom that we built. And then the other pillar was micro projects. Of all the projects that were presented in the region, almost 50 projects, 10 of them were selected, and we gave them 10,000 euros each to all these 10 projects that were going to be developed and implemented in the different areas where the schools are located. So these schools receive a fund that is being managed by us, by UNITAR, but that was provided by Amazon in this case, because it was fully funded by Amazon. And the third main pillar was reforestation. So we plan to reforest in this first pilot phase 500 hectares. And we still have the goal to reach 1 million. So thousands and thousands of trees were planted, and hundreds of thousands of seeds were disseminated along a very, very big area that we'll see later that was a terrible destroyed by fire. Next, please. So it was very important to have a virtual class, although we have our team and we have many experts going to all different schools to support them, designing the project and later implementing the project. But of course, we need to allow them to have their time to go through this classroom, to go through the training, because we designed these training courses for the different ages. And then they could complete the courses through the platform, the UNCC Learn platform. So they would be learning about the SDG, they would be learning about climate change, they would be designing the nature-based solution micro projects, because they knew that those micro projects would be endorsed by this funded and could be implemented in real. And next, please. So the UNCC Learn platform that maybe many of you know is a UNITAR platform, managed by the Division of the Planet. In all these courses, they have different content, so they can understand better about the poverty and the environment. They can understand about the drivers behind integrating policy planning, identifying challenges, or giving examples like the one that now they can give to others. Next, please. So this training was accompanied by workshops. So they would be learning and practice how to deliver seeds and how to build their own bombs and how they call it, the seed bombs. And then it was very funny for all these thousands and thousands of students that were accompanying us during every weekend of the time during 4 months. So they would throw these seeds that after when the water comes, when the rain comes, would be living there, the new trees that they will be visiting and, let's say, adopt the tree for the future. Next, please. So micro projects for us are natural-based solution. So how to improve the environment with a practical solution that can benefit the natural environment and also the society, the one that are participating. Because of course we were selecting the projects and we were taking the very excellent advice from the experts that were advising us and the schools of what to do, which plants are needed, or where is the area that is more damaged and we need to act, and many other issues. Thank you. Next, please. So promoting the development and giving financial support to the actions. It's not that sometimes the students just make a plan, they decided what should be done for us to do it. In this case, they were planning what they were going to do and encourage learning environments, of course, and foster the actions with active methodologies to change in teaching practices. Next, please. So here, just to share a few slides about the area. As you can see, a very, very big area that was devastated by several fires. So it was an incredible fire that took place for different weeks in the south of Spain, in the Mediterranean area. Next, please. That's the affected area. And next, please. Well, this is just an explanation of how when climate change can also affect very dramatic to one area and destroy the area. Also, climate change was part of the issue that happened, because very, very high temperatures and also the wind and very few raining in the area. So all of this was just terrible variables together. Next, please. So we decided to go and start planning in the areas where the experts and the region was allocating the project. Next, please. Next, please. We cannot see very well, but okay, this is the how it's called Nendo Dango, the seed bombs. These are flattened balls of clay and organic matter that confine and provide nutrients to the seeds until the first rains. They contain native shrub species whose mission is to hold the soil and provide shelter for wildlife. So it's impressive how you can really do a good impactful. Sometimes you just plant trees and that's not enough. But this solution is a very practical solution, very cheap solution, and you can really spread out 400,000 of this Nendo Dango during the morning. You can also use, as we did, drones to get to the most difficult areas where a student could not reach. So this for us was also a training, how to learn, how to do it, how to prepare, how to train, how to act. Next, please. Well, I forgot to say that in this case, the seeds have cayenne, this pepper solution, in order for the birds not to bite and not to eat them. So that was also a practical solution that the expert gave to us. So just to end up, how to join us in the future, now that we are preparing with Amazon the scale up of the project. We are trying to find the places, so where CFAL centers are located, that would be the implementing partner. UNITAR will be supervising in support with the International Sustainable Foundation, also based in Malaga, with CFAL Malaga. And then we will try to find the governments, local governments, regional governments, national governments, that would like to be part of the project, that maybe could provide the seeds or the plants for the project, and we will get the fund mainly from Amazon and from other private companies. So if you'd like to participate, please let us know. You can write to UNITAR, to us, and you can take a look also in the webpage that is here, and it's in Spanish, but also in English. So please join us as a new green helmet around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julio, for explaining some elements of the Green Helmets initiative. This could be used as the platform, definitely could be used as a platform to join efforts of different stakeholders, including parliamentarians, to offer the appropriate context to include young people, and also to save the planet, as you mentioned before. It's really good. Thank you very much. Let me warmly welcome now Mr. Daniel Uribe, Lead Program Officer of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Program of the South Center. He has wide experience in research, including on human rights, sustainable development, investment, South-South, and triangular cooperation. He advises governments and civil society organizations in international instruments negotiations. Previously, he served as coordinator of the Chamber of Case Selection at the Constitutional Court of Ecuador and as eligibility and legal officer at the Division for Refugees at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of his country. Please, Mr. Uribe, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Ana Lucia, and thank you very much, the organizers, UNITAR and GOPAC, for this important event. If I'm allowed, I would like to use interpretation and then use my mother tongue. I always do that because it's interesting to see how we can use our mother tongue in these cases. So I will use Spanish, if that's fine with you. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente a los organizadores de este importante evento. Realmente es un gusto para mí y para el South Center poder participar con ustedes. El Centro Sur es una organización intergubernamental conformada por 55 países en desarrollo de todo el sur global. Bueno, lo que queríamos compartir el día de hoy, no sé si ustedes pueden ver la imagen, espero que sí lo puedan ver. La presentación del día de hoy vamos a compartir un poco de las experiencias que se han llevado a cabo respecto a la transparencia en cambio climático y en acción climática. Específicamente cuál es el rol que los parlamentos pueden tener dentro del marco jurídico y del marco también práctico de protección de este tipo de eventos y características. Primeramente tenemos que entender que, como lo dijo el profesor Néstor, este es un tema muy importante, el mayor elemento que tenemos que considerar son los desafíos que los países están enfrentando actualmente con respecto al financiamiento climático. En la actualidad sabemos que a pesar de que hay una movilización que está aumentando poco a poco respecto al financiamiento de acciones climáticas, realmente este es bastante limitado. Pero a pesar de ser limitado, realmente engloba una gran cantidad de recursos que pueden o no estar conectados a riesgos de corrupción, por lo cual es necesario comenzar a considerar cuáles son estos riesgos y cómo poder superarlos y principalmente identificarlos. Esto también nace por la forma en la que este tipo de financiamiento es abordado. Estos no siempre se llevan a cabo por medio de canales tradicionales de financiamiento, sino que también se están creando nuevos mecanismos de financiamiento que pueden ser innovadores, pero al mismo tiempo presentan riesgos de corrupción. Por ejemplo, ya no solamente hablamos de inversión de capital por parte de inversores privados, sino que también estamos hablando de préstamos por grupos financieros, estamos hablando de entrega de bonos, por ejemplo, los bonos de carbono, y también de subvenciones públicas. Estamos hablando también de instrumentos de mitigación de riesgo por parte de la inversión privada. Por ejemplo, hablamos de seguros, de garantías y de acuerdos de compra por medio del cual un organismo público puede estar realmente transfiriendo o aceptando un poco de riesgo de inversiones públicas justamente para poder incrementar este tipo de inversión dentro del sector del cambio climático. Y además de esto, también nos vemos enfrentados a nuevos instrumentos que presuntamente están encaminados hacia, por ejemplo, una transición energética, pero que al mismo tiempo tienen graves incursiones dentro de lo que puede ser la transparencia pública. Por ejemplo, el tema de subsidios. ¿Qué tipo de sectores pueden tener una característica de subsidios? ¿Qué tipo de empresas pueden recibir estos subsidios? Y cómo estos subsidios realmente afectan a nivel general la situación de un país en específico. Como también lo dijo el profesor Nest, no todas las situaciones, no todos los países se enmarcan dentro de un mismo aspecto o una misma situación de cambio climático, y todos ellos requieren y necesitan diferentes tipos de mecanismos de adaptación y mitigación que no necesariamente implican un nivel global de estándares. Y justamente esto nos lleva a que, por ejemplo, se haya establecido la necesidad de contar con mecanismos establecidos para países en desarrollo que no realmente logren superar un límite exagerado de transparencia como pueden tener los países desarrollados. Justamente la idea de contar con este tipo de flexibilidad para los países que se encaminan en desarrollo, que están en desarrollo, se da por la necesidad que estos países tienen para poder realmente hacer cara o poder enfrentar este tipo de riesgos que se generan a partir de sus propias experiencias. Esto nos lleva a pensar que cuando hablamos de corrupción y cambio climático, no podemos realmente enfocarnos en un solo estándar o en una solución que se aplique para todos, sino que se tiene que discutir acerca de la realidad de cada país y esencialmente de la situación que cada país enfrenta. Pero al mismo tiempo no podemos hablar en silos, no podemos hablar simplemente de corrupción y cambio climático, sino que tenemos que hablar de cómo la corrupción y el cambio climático afectan otro tipo de elementos a nivel social y también a nivel cultural. Vemos entonces que a pesar de que realmente el tema de financiamiento para el cambio climático está enfrentando muchos desafíos, vemos que el nivel de financiamiento es bastante alto. Por ejemplo, el gráfico que estamos viendo en este momento está observando cuál es la cantidad de dinero que se cuenta actualmente año tras año. Este es un documento realizado por el Programa del Medio Ambiente de las Naciones Unidas en el 2022, donde hacen un análisis de cuál es la cantidad de financiamiento que se ha otorgado para soluciones en la naturaleza. Hay dos tipos de mecanismos de financiamiento para el tema del cambio climático. Uno es basado en soluciones que no implican realmente la protección del medio ambiente, sino que implican la reducción de la emisión de gases, por ejemplo, el tema de subsidios de transporte o de la transición energética, pero otras están basadas en la protección del medio ambiente, la protección de la diversidad marina, la protección de la biodiversidad terrestre. Entonces, el Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente generó este análisis de cuánto financiamiento se está otorgando anualmente para poder encontrar soluciones medioambientales, de protección medioambientales, que también conlleven a una protección del cambio climático. En este sentido, se ve que la mayor cantidad de financiamiento que ha sido otorgado, a pesar de que es limitado, pero la mayor cantidad de financiamiento, aproximadamente 126,000 millones de dólares, provienen del sector público. Es el sector público el que más está otorgando financiamiento para este tipo de desarrollos, tanto a nivel doméstico como también por medio de otros programas de desarrollo. Al mismo tiempo, el sector privado sí contribuye aproximadamente 26,000 millones de dólares, pero vemos que este tipo, como lo vamos a ver un poco más adelante, estos 26,000 millones de dólares no son otorgados simplemente como un préstamo o como una muestra de buena voluntad. Realmente el nivel de compromiso del financiamiento privado por medio de, por ejemplo, por medio de programas que no sean préstamos o que no sean beneficiosos o que no provengan como tipo de préstamo, son bastante limitados. Y por último, la asistencia oficial para el desarrollo, que en principio era una de las características básicas de los compromisos adoptados por los países desarrollados hacia el cambio climático, es bastante limitada. Es aproximadamente 2,000 millones de dólares anuales. A esto hay que tomar en cuenta que, por ejemplo, durante el último año escuchamos que muchísimos países desarrollados están realizando una doble contabilidad de este tipo de fondos, por los cuales asistencia para el desarrollo otorgada, por ejemplo, para fines humanitarios o fines de refugio, está siendo contada también como financiamiento para el cambio climático o para soluciones basadas en la naturaleza. Así que vemos que inclusive en estos casos el tema de transparencia también puede ser un poco afectado. Si tomamos en cuenta que en general la mayor cantidad del dinero con el que contamos es realmente dinero proveniente del sector público, la necesidad de tener transparencia, de fortalecer los mecanismos de transparencia y además de generar mecanismos de transparencia de los presupuestos públicos es mucho más importante. Vemos entonces en este segundo cuadro cuál es la necesidad real de financiamiento para poder solventar o para poder lograr los objetivos establecidos en el Acuerdo de París, que es reducir a 1.5 grados centígrados el calentamiento global para el 2035 aproximadamente, 2050. Y vemos que aquí, por ejemplo, la necesidad real de fondos anuales es de 11 trillones de dólares. ¿Sí? Son realmente una diferencia, una diferencia bastante importante entre los fondos que se necesitan y los fondos que realmente se están proveyendo, a pesar de que casi el 86% de esa cantidad de fondos proviene del sector público. Esto ha llevado a que dentro de la narrativa que existe de la acción climática y del financiamiento climático, se requiere incentivar la participación del sector privado, justamente para poder incrementar ese financiamiento necesario para solventar las necesidades de acción climática sobre mitigación y adaptación al cambio climático. Y aquí es donde vemos cuál es realmente los flujos de financiamiento privado hacia el cambio climático o hacia solventar esas necesidades de cambio climático basadas en soluciones en la naturaleza. Vemos que el total de 26.000 millones de dólares, la mayoría de esa cantidad de dinero, casi 8.000 millones de dólares, son otorgados hacia la garantía o la protección de las cadenas de valor. Las cadenas de valor agregadas supply chains, que son justamente las cadenas de valor de las cuales dependen las grandes multinacionales. Pues la mayor cantidad de dinero realmente está incorporada dentro del propio grupo corporativo, más allá de generar mecanismos de acción climática o de mitigación y adaptación dentro de la jurisdicción de un país. Esto realmente se ve compartido dentro de un grupo corporativo. Al mismo tiempo, vemos que la cantidad de dinero que ha sido otorgado como préstamos no concesionales o simplemente concesiones por medio de organizaciones filantrópicas o de organizaciones de la sociedad civil se reduce a 4.000 millones de dólares. Entonces vemos que una cantidad de dinero se constituye dentro de lo que es beneficioso para las empresas. Y aquí es donde lo que el profesor Nest había sugerido al final de su presentación, que el tema del financiamiento climático realmente no es un compromiso global, sino más bien es un mercado global, es mucho más palpable, donde vemos que lo que hacen las compañías multinacionales es contener ese dinero que están realmente invirtiendo dentro de lo que es, o se puede conocer como acción climática, la están incurriendo dentro de procesos que generan beneficios para ellos mismos, reducción de costos dentro de sus cadenas globales, garantizar, por ejemplo, el tema de compra de mercado de bono de carbonos, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Pero esto también nos lleva a otro de los problemas o desafíos dentro del financiamiento, que es el greenwashing o el face washing, por el cual muchas compañías que están invirtiendo de una u otra forma dentro de su propia cadena global de suministro, lo están haciendo únicamente para poder contar con una cara limpia, por llamarlo así, dentro de todo el mercado global de cambio climático y de acción climática. Esto también es conocido, por ejemplo, mediante las inversiones estratégicas, por el cual ellos lo que hacen es intentar incentivar o publicitar su imagen como imagen de una empresa verde, pero realmente no están cumpliendo con los objetivos establecidos en el Acuerdo de París y tampoco están cumpliendo con las propias estándares establecidos dentro de su legislación nacional. Ahora que entendimos cuáles son esos desafíos de financiamiento que no solamente enfrentan los países en desarrollo, sino también a nivel global, queremos entender un poco cuál es el impacto real entre la corrupción y el cambio climático. Y aquí voy a hacer uso, profesor Nest, de uno de sus documentos que publicó en el 2019, donde usted realiza una correlación entre el elemento de corrupción y el incremento de las vulnerabilidades con respecto al cambio climático. Esto fue publicado por Transparency International en el 2019. Y lo que se hace aquí en esta imagen es de manera muy clara, es ejemplificar cómo un alto nivel de corrupción realmente incrementa las vulnerabilidades que tienen los estados respecto al cambio climático. Y cómo esto puede generarse, cómo esto se puede realmente percibir de una manera científica, por llamarlo así, dentro de un análisis de correlación. Lo que sucede ya en la práctica es que cuando vemos los hechos de corrupción y cómo estos efectos, cómo los efectos de corrupción realmente, o estos impactos se sienten en las sociedades más vulnerables del cambio climático, se pueden ver lo que está sucediendo actualmente, por ejemplo, en países como en Pakistán, como en Ecuador, como en Colombia, como en Brasil, como en Bolivia y otros países en desarrollo, donde el aumento, por ejemplo, el incremento del calor o el incremento de lluvias torrenciales ha llevado a que comunidades vulnerables al cambio climático se vean más afectadas. Oxfam International, Oxfam International, a partir del 2017-2018, con Mary Robinson como una de sus embajadores, comenzó a realizar un análisis de la mayoría de casos que los países han estado sufriendo con respecto al cambio climático. Y en estos casos que los llaman tribunales públicos o juicios públicos, lo que hacían era llamar a comunidades afectadas por el cambio climático a poder detallar cuáles fueron los hechos que realmente llevaron a que ellas sufran acerca de este tipo de efectos del cambio climático. Y hay dos casos bastante importantes, uno en Uganda, de una comunidad en Uganda, en la cual un grupo de mujeres incentivaron o crearon un grupo específico de protección de los derechos de la mujer, porque lo que ellos estaban viendo era que a partir del 2005-2006, el incremento de lluvias torrenciales llevó a que toda su producción agrícola se vea afectada por inundaciones que en anteriores años no se habían visto. Y lo importante que este grupo intentó visibilizar fue que las autoridades de ese momento y las autoridades también locales intentaron desarrollar esta idea como un castigo divino. La idea era que las lluvias venían como un castigo divino. Y realmente hubo un proceso bastante complejo para poder determinar que realmente lo que estaba sucediendo era que se habían otorgado licencias medioambientales para la producción o para abrir minas, para la minería, dentro de una región que afectaba a esta comunidad, y que lo que hacía con las lluvias torrenciales era incrementar el nivel de riesgo de inundaciones de esta comunidad, pero la comunidad nunca fue contactada para poder saber cuáles eran esos riesgos, y tampoco fue contactada para poder determinar si es que ellos deseaban o no este tipo de procesos. Entonces, el otorgamiento de este tipo de licencias, que no tienen realmente una licencia social, como podría llamarse, incrementó el riesgo que estas comunidades podían tener respecto al cambio climático con este tipo de cambios de eventos extremos de la naturaleza. Entonces, esto llevó a que haya una mayor clarificación de cuáles eran las necesidades y las vulnerabilidades que tenían estas comunidades. Y este gráfico justamente determina eso. Cuando hay menor transparencia o mayor riesgo de corrupción, se genera realmente un mayor nivel de vulnerabilidad. Y este nivel de vulnerabilidad tiene que ser atendido o tiene que ser solucionado de una u otra forma por medio de los parlamentos, por ejemplo. Aquí, en esta imagen, vemos ya dentro de los países desarrollados, no dentro de los países en desarrollo, sino desarrollados, vemos un poco cuáles podrían ser los efectos del cambio climático si no se toman medidas efectivas de protección a este tipo de grupos o personas afectadas. Entonces vemos, por ejemplo, que en Australia, si no se logra realmente alcanzar el nivel de 1.5 grados centígrados, vemos que aproximadamente 1 millón de personas van a ser afectadas por tema de calores extremos. Aproximadamente su producción agrícola va a reducirse en un 2.75%, y esto lo vemos en casi todos los países. Vemos, por ejemplo, que en Estados Unidos 9.5 millones de personas van a ser los más afectados. Después de entender estas vulnerabilidades, vamos a entender cuál es el rol de los parlamentos, y lo vamos a hacer por medio de 4 ejemplos prácticos. En general, vemos que el rol de los parlamentos pueden verse como mejorar el monitoreo, el reporte y la verificación de las acciones a nivel climático y también de sus políticas, establecer leyes que puedan promover legislaciones del cambio climático y también marcos de transparencia. Como lo dijo Walter en su momento, el control de los acuerdos internacionales y de las negociaciones también que llevan estos gobiernos a nivel internacional en tema de cambio climático, por ejemplo, y también el análisis y adoptar este tipo de presupuestos que cumplen con los principios del cambio climático. Y aquí tengo 4 ejemplos y con eso termino. El primero es el de Uganda. Uganda creó un foro parlamentario para el cambio climático que permite establecer nuevos roles para los parlamentarios dentro de la discusión de cambio climático. Y justamente establece estos 4 elementos: el monitoreo de la implementación de actividades de cambio climático, el apoyo a legislación sobre cambio climático, el diálogo y representación de cambio climático y también el análisis de presupuesto. Nueva Zelanda, por su lado, creó un comisionado especial para el cambio climático que tiene la posibilidad de solicitar y recibir información acerca de las acciones que se están tomando respecto al cambio climático e inclusive puede realizar investigaciones respecto a este tipo de acciones o medidas que apoyan el cambio climático. República Dominicana adoptó un marco legal que permite establecer cuáles son los roles específicos de cada uno de los gobiernos, tanto locales como también a nivel nacional, y las entidades que están encargadas de recolectar, de presentar y de realizar el reporte de información sobre cambio climático. Y por último, en el caso de Pakistán, Pakistán creó un grupo consejero de expertos que permiten al Parlamento adoptar leyes en base a información específica científica que ha sido otorgada por este grupo de expertos a nivel nacional. Con esto les agradezco, muchísimas gracias. Discúlpenme si me pasé muchísimo tiempo y les devuelvo la palabra a ustedes. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Daniel, por compartir buenas prácticas y como tú has resaltado, independientemente de qué tan desarrollado se crea un país, depende de las prioridades que establezca para las iniciativas que tenga. Es bueno saber que hay buenas prácticas de países en vías de desarrollo que son los que por lo general son más afectados. Now, let me turn to English. We are keen to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Mario Aguilera. He's an international lawyer and researcher. He has worked on the project Environmental Rights in Cultural Context of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, as well as for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and has published in the field of the law of human rights and the environment. He currently serves as an expert at the Forest Stewardship Council. Please, Dr. Aguilera, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear participants. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some of the ideas I have developed in my book on the law of human rights and the environment in Latin America and the Caribbean. I don't know whether you can show the presentation, please. Next, please. So, the objective of my research was to examine and compare the environmental human rights recognized under 2 key regional instruments: the American Convention on Human Rights, which I shall refer to as the American Convention, and the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, the so-called Escazú Agreement. In concrete terms, by comparing these 2 instruments, I wanted to know if they address the protection of environmental human rights from a similar conceptual approach, and what are the main features of a regional environmental human rights framework. So, what are environmental human rights? A broad understanding of environmental human rights defines them as those basic rights related to the environment and climate. In what form? By recognizing, on the one hand, procedural human rights whose exercise contributes to the protecting the environment and climate, such as access to information, as has been mentioned, participation, and access to justice. And on the other hand, by recognizing those substantive rights whose exercise depends on a healthy environment and climate, or which are particularly vulnerable to environmental damage and climate change. Of course, the right to a healthy environment, but others, such as the right to life, health, water, food, among others. Having established the context and the meaning of the basic concept of this presentation, I would like to spend the main findings of my research. I reached 3 main conclusions, which I will present together with their justifications. Next, please. Firstly, I have shown that there is a common regional perspective on environmental human rights. So, when you look at the conceptual ideas that animate the conventions, you quickly realize just how much the conventions are trying to do. Both instruments aim clearly to recognize and ensure the interdependent and indivisible relationship between human rights, environmental protection, democracy, and sustainable development, or with a view to social environmental justice. And secondly, to guarantee environmental human rights and cooperation as tools to facilitate the same. An analysis of the contents of the two conventions led me to observe that both instruments include four main pillars to facilitate their aims. These are substantive rights, which include the right to the environment, procedural rights, which include not only the rights to access to information, participation, and access to justice, but also the freedoms of expression and association, fairness conditions for vulnerable persons and groups, and capacity building and cooperation. The relationship between aims and pillars is as follows. The exercise of procedural rights, which are necessary for democracy, is intrinsically related to protecting the environment, the climate, and substantive human rights. Equal human rights, protection, and environmental and climate conservation are interests covered under the state's obligation to achieve sustainable development according to the imperative of justice. Looking below the surface of this normative scheme, you can see that the conventions embody a political commitment to the global values of democracy, human rights, and sustainable development to deal with the practical realities of the regional context. Here I mean things like recognizing social and cultural differences, improving natural resource and climate governance, solving social environmental disputes, and guaranteeing an equal distribution of profits and environmental burdens derived from an increasing use of natural resources and related emissions. Not forgetting that this is the most biologically diverse and the most unequal region in the world. Secondly, next please. I show that the pillar of fairness conditions for vulnerable persons and groups firmly establishes the regional commitment to the value of social environmental justice. This pillar is the main feature of the regional framework. Conceptually, the relationship between a fair procedure during participation, access to information, access to justice, and a fair outcome requires a different treatment for vulnerable persons and groups. Different treatment implies recognizing fairness conditions to break down the barriers that cause inequality during sustainable decision making. So what does the pillar on fairness conditions for vulnerable persons and groups actually include? There are procedural requirements related to certain aspects of vulnerability, such as a lack of awareness regarding environmental rights, language, literacy, costs, physical location, cultural context, and fear of reprisal. And based on a normative presumption of the vulnerability of indigenous peoples, local communities, and human rights defenders, the pillar includes additional specific enhanced safeguards for them. This pillar is significant because it shows that procedural rights are not enough, particularly if the social political context makes it difficult for those rights to be exercised. As a result, the regional equality agenda becomes an agenda of recognition of social differences and redistribution under the concept of vulnerability. Given that inequality and a deep-rooted culture of privilege are the most important challenges in the region, the pillar of fairness conditions illustrates the normative force of context and constitutes the cornerstone of the regional framework when considering its ulterior project of consolidating a regime of social environmental justice. The last conceptual thesis indicates that an understanding of sustainable development, which also underlies most of governance for climate change, that excludes specific references to non-discriminatory environmental rights as an integral component of the concept, remains incomplete. The concept of sustainable development puts human beings and equality at its core, especially concerning the inclusion of those furthest behind. As a normative concept, sustainable development was conceived as a paradigm to reconcile competing and conflicting interests in economic growth, social justice, and environmental integrity. However, international legal instruments related to this concept have failed to address the fundamental aspects of procedural and distributive social justice inherent in its normative claim. This means that without concrete legal guarantees to protect the environment, climate, and the interests of persons and groups, especially those vulnerable, sustainable development law remains incomplete due to the unfairness of the democratic process for balancing competing interests. As a result, the normative and policy instruments of sustainable development law de facto function to prioritize other interests. And let's say clear economic interests. We were talking about capture corporate interests and so on. So the path is kind of clear for those interests. The relationship between the pillars and the aims that animate the convention show that in the Latin American and Caribbean region, environmental human rights have been designed and understood as tools for protecting substantive interests related to the environment, climate, and human rights, and for striking a proper balance when these and other interests, such as economic interests, are not necessarily aligned. Against this background, the new regional framework, comprising the American Convention and the Escazú Agreement, becomes a concrete example of how sustainable development should operate to address its normative claim, namely achieving integration and balance with a view to procedural and distributive justice. In other words, leaving no one behind. Next, please. So much for the contents of my book. However, I did not want to miss the opportunity to give a couple of specific examples on how environmental human rights are relevant for climate litigation. Next, please. And next, please. In a recent paper published by Messi, Colombo, and Ricaurte, these authors identify several procedural and structural barriers in climate litigation, as raised by practitioners from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. Those included the following, which you can see in the slide. First, absence of independent public actors advocating for climate matters through litigation. Second, lack of sufficiently broad standing rules. Third, language restrictions for affected non-dominant communities. Fourth, evidence production hurdles. Fifth, lack of knowledge about climate change law by judicial actors. And sixth, ineffective mechanisms to enforce and monitor judgment compliance. The regional framework includes standards for all the identified procedural and institutional barriers. Due to time constraints, I'll just focus on the second barrier, which is a very relevant one, that related to standing rules. So, on the lack of sufficiently broad standing rules, Article 8.3c of the Escazú Agreement answers the matter by explicitly establishing the obligation to guarantee broad legal standing in defense of the environment. In that sense, the parties are called upon to establish individual, representative, and collective action proceedings, including public interest litigation and class action lawsuits for protecting the environment and climate. This proposition is supported by other contexts of the agreement and is further developed in the environmental jurisprudence of the Intermediate Court of Human Rights. It should be noted that the implementation stage of the regional framework on environmental human rights entails the beginning of a feedback loop aimed at guaranteeing environmental social justice, not only in the region, but beyond. So now we have to remember the contribution of the regional framework to the global narrative of sustainable development. National developments to implement international obligations will inform the activities of the conventional bodies of both the Escazú Agreement and the Inter-American System, which at the same time should affect national implementation. National implementation, of course, will be led by parliamentarians and courts. As a result, environmental human rights and related principles leave behind their entirely domestic nature to become elements of transnational interest and character. Next, please. So, thank you very much. I hope I was on time, yeah, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aguilera, for sharing some findings of your interesting book. We also warmly invite all the attendees to take a look of this important material that you have worked on. Now, I will give the floor to our director, Mr. Alex.
Thank you, Ana Lucia. Thank you to all of you distinguished speakers, and particularly thank you for the participants that are still with us after 1 hour and a half exactly. We'll make the most of this short time that we have for a final round of comments, questions, and remarks from the speakers. So let me go straight to the point, and in the end, I will ask kindly Dr. Firas to give us some very short closing remarks. But please bear with us a few minutes. Very important conclusions and follow-up. The first one goes to Ambassador Walter Schultz from the Republic of Ecuador. Dr. Schultz is an excellent friend of the House and someone that we greatly admire for his very many roles when it comes to issues related to the environment and the global governance on issues of the environment. So to Dr. Schultz, what innovative financial mechanisms and policy frameworks, perhaps, can be implemented to enhance collaboration between the public and private sectors? The idea, of course, is to accelerate investments in climate finance, sustainable development, but we feel that we still need to understand better how public and private can work together. Dear Dr. Schultz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Alex, and thank you all the participants as well for the question. There is no silver bullet, as some of the other panelists have mentioned. There is a tendency, a trend towards the blended finance. More and more, there is this, even within the old, but of course also the new funds, try to utilize and encourage this combination of different instruments and financial instruments. I would say that innovative, if not because of hasn't been used in the past, but innovative in terms of the wider use, could be debt swaps, debt for nature swaps. It has to be very carefully mentioned, because we don't want that credits become the growing source of finance and then make the swap, because then at the end of the day, why we take the credit if we're going to swap it afterwards? But the debt exists already there, and it hasn't been used for that. And we pay, the developing countries pay large amounts of debt services, and then debt swaps have proven to be an important and innovative, in terms of the scale, tool that could be used. Otherwise, and that it could be innovative as well in terms of the financial climate architecture, or climate finance architecture, is SDRs, special drawing rights. We have some countries, or a few countries, have been advocating for that in the past, and it was only in the COP 2 COPs ago in Glasgow, for the very first time in the main decision of that COP was included a reference to SDR, which also is another, would be an innovative source of finance in terms of climate architecture, because we haven't been used. So just those two examples of what could be used in terms of mobilizing more growing, because the needs are, as it was mentioned, on the trillions, and we're not even yet fulfilled the 100 billion that was already committed for 2020 until 2025. Thank
you. Thank you very much, dear Walter. Thank you for the time you have given us today and for your willingness to share your knowledge. Now, having Dr. Michael Nest is quite an honor for us, and I mean it. Dr. Nest, some of you heard, is a reputed, very widely read author of very many books on this topic, and several other things that have contributed to society. So I need to give you the commercial, dear participants. It would be great if you go and just Google his books. And if you go to Amazon, you'll see why I say what I just said. A very interesting author of very complex topics. But now the question, dear Michael, if I may, to the point. How can Parliament strengthen the role in oversight of this topic and in ensuring effective climate action, while holding governments and private sector accountable for their commitments under international climate agreements? To you.
Thank you for that question. I mean, it's a very big question, and there are many complicated aspects to the response. So first of all, I think speaking openly and publicly about corruption, especially cases of corruption related to climate initiatives, that's something that they can do. So we know that there are confidentiality provisions at different stages of an investigation where there is very little probably that can be divulged. But in some cases, the institutions involved, the kind of project, what went wrong, that can be talked about, even if specific details can't be mentioned. The reason that's important is, first of all, to introduce into the public domain and to create discussions amongst different stakeholders simply about the fact that there are corruption problems. And that's the basis for what to do about them, so what solutions are. So that's one response. The other is parliamentarians. So we know that often they might be opposition parliamentarians and not necessarily part of government, part of the ruling party. they can understand the UN provisions that have been signed up to by states, by state parties. For example, UNCAC, so the Agreement Against Corruption, the agreement on transnational organized crime, and of course on climate change itself. So if they understand what state parties have agreed to, it means it gives them some leverage. And again, talking about this publicly and talking about this in Parliament, it can put pressure on states, on governments, ruling parties to actually do what they had committed to do. In regard to businesses, it can be more difficult because it will depend on law. So really, we're talking about the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear that's not necessarily about regulation. Where there is regulation, then I think it is extremely important, of course, that parliamentarians point out when regulations are not being applied and there is not an even playing field, and some businesses are allowed to get away with things. So I think that's important. But parliamentarians, so I saw in the Q&A, I've been looking at that during the presentations. Someone raised in the Q&A about the parliamentarians cannot necessarily, or Parliament cannot necessarily go and do an investigation itself of all the facts. But parliamentarians have a public profile, they have connections to the media, they can start conversations, and they can invite all kinds of stakeholders together. In some countries where regime types make it difficult for civil society to speak out, certainly against corruption, but sometimes even against climate change, parliamentarians can still host events and invite those parties, and it gives them some security. It gives civil society some security that they're being hosted by a parliamentarian, and introduce them to businesses and create discussions where people begin to understand each other's perspectives, but also what the limitations are and why their position, in the case of business, for example, might be criticized by community groups. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Indeed, very specific actions that could be taken, particularly from parliaments. Let me now go to Mr. Daniel Uribe. Dear Daniel, you are an expert on public policy, and we greatly respect the South Center. Thank you also for being with us today. I'll ask you a very particular question when it comes to ESG. So we all know that environmental, social, and governance frameworks are a reality now, not only a discussion, particularly in Europe, with the adoption of the CSRD and several other decisions, continental decisions that make it mandatory for corporations and small and medium enterprises progressively to report on what they do in these issues. Let me try, from the point of view, again, of the role of parliaments in issues related to climate change and corruption. Let me talk about greenwashing. As many of us understand, this is a reality. There are some comments that we have received also in that sense. So how can public policy, dear Daniel, prevent greenwashing, that companies, if I may say, pretend that something is happening where it's not? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. A really interesting question. The South Center actually produced a policy brief recently, like 1 month ago, on ESG's governance, particularly looking at the human rights issue. But I think it also applies to the climate change discussion, particularly on the environment component of ESG. I think that the government has 2 options, or at least 2 options, when you are looking at how to avoid greenwashing. One of the examples, of the clear examples, is not happening in Europe. The European Union just adopted a directive looking at human rights due diligence. And when they are looking at human rights due diligence, they are setting clear standards of what companies should do and how they have to implement this kind of directives, and particularly which kind of standards they have to apply, not just to share information, but actually to create a corporate culture that allows the protection not only of their workers, so the kind of traditional due diligence, but actually extends to the relationship they have with respect to the communities where the subsidiaries are working on. And they are looking also at the issue of environment. Then the question is, of course, as Professor Ness was rightly saying and rightly pointing out, the directive is there. Now is the issue of implementation and how they have to implement it. And I think that there is the gap that we find with corruption. When you have not sufficient institutions to protect the implementation and to strengthen the implementation of those kind of directives, then you will face the issue of greenwashing. So in one way or another, you can have at least two mechanisms. One is establishing good directives with a strong and uniform standards that apply to all companies. And secondly, you will have to strengthen the institutions which are in charge of implementing that particular directive. Without the both, then the government will just look at how companies do something without actually doing it. And I think that is one of the weakest links with respect to ESG. ESG is a framework which is not necessarily mandatory. It's mandatory for you to apply it, but then the standards that you have to apply are completely voluntary. And what firms are doing normally is that the firms who are hired to make the audits of ESG, they create the standard that will be applicable for your own firm. So this is kind of a standard which is more or less created for your company, so you will comply with it without necessarily achieving the final objective of ESG. Thank you very much.
Well said, very much so. And I greatly regret that we have very limited time, because that in itself will be a long conversation. By the way, and before we go to our last distinguished speaker, I want to share with you that Mr. Julio Andrade had just to disconnect, but we were happy that he also came. Let me say something in absentia. We wanted to complement this conversation looking at one particular project like the Green Helmets that he discussed, that actually help us to develop ownership that prevents corruption in the new generation. Young people mobilize for the protection of the environment and so on, as you heard from him. So we thank him in absentia, as I say. But let me go now to Dr. Mario Aguilera. You're a reputed international lawyer and researcher, and I was very much enjoying your presentation on the linkages between human rights and issues of environment, climate change, and the whole of society, as we say. So the question is as follows. I was given the question in Spanish, so I kindly ask the interpreters to help us here. But the last part in Spanish. ¿Cómo piensa usted que se dará la implementación de los derechos humanos ambientales en el marco regional? Y en eso apreciaría muchísimo que, ya usted mencionó algo, que se explayara en ese linkage entre derechos humanos y ambiente, porque pienso que mucha gente se beneficiaría de escucharlo. Doctor Aguilera.
Thank you, Alex. Well, implementation at the national level depends between jurisdiction according to the rules governing the incorporation of international law and the hierarchy with domestic legal orders. When we think about the region, most Latin American states are monist, meaning that international law is equivalent to domestic law and therefore is being directly enforceable in domestic courts. Against this framework, I would say that there is a justified expectation about the important role that courts will play in the implementation of the standards of the regional framework, even surpassing regulatory action, I would say, at some points. And of course, we have to highlight the importance of legal practitioners involved in climate and environmental litigation in order to move forward, to mobilize these standards, and to help, I would say, at the same time, courts and parliaments to understand the importance of the matter. Nevertheless, I have to mention that there are specific clauses, specific contents which are of programmatic nature. For example, establishing institutions, guaranteeing that there are competent entities with access to expertise in environmental matters, oversight mechanisms that guarantee access to information, which will require the action of parliaments, meaning regulatory action. Regarding the relationship between the environment and human rights, well, now we have a lot of information produced by, for example, the independent expert and now a special rapporteur on the right to the environment of the United Nations. The first was Professor Knox, now Professor Boyd. No, he left. Now we have a new rapporteur. We showed that this close relationship between we need a healthy environment in order that human rights thrive, and we are able to use our procedural human rights in order to protect the environment and the climate. And that we have the importance, both elements, the procedural rights, access to information, participation, and access to justice in order to protect the environment and the climate. And at the same time, the importance of giving content to the substantive rights. And there we have the obligation of states to determine what is a healthy environment in order that the people can live in good conditions. And in that regard, I also want to mention that we have to be clear about the differences regarding the impacts of environmental damage and climate change on different sectors of societies. And because of that importance of having this social agenda of recognition of differences, of social differences within the regional frame. And I leave it there.
Well said, and thank you very much. And with that, dear panelists and participants, we have exhausted our time, but we won't leave until we hear some final remarks on behalf of GOPAC. All of this was possible thanks to the support and guidance of a Global Organization for Parliamentarians Against Corruption. So for some concluding remarks, allow me to invite again Dr. Firas Al-Haditi, the Executive Director of GOPAC. Dear Firas.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Of course, we always say that I thank Alex for his support, and he thanks me for his support. I don't know. I believe that he's supporting me, not me supporting him. But anyways, I would like to thank everybody. I mean, this was a very nice dialogue to which I listened carefully. We listened to finance, we listened to law, we had a case study on the green helmets, and we have human rights and anti-corruption, and as well we had some geography, the atlas and so on. Very interesting ideas. They were very beneficial. I mean, for me personally, I have few ideas in mind, thanks to the speakers, and I would like to invite everybody, the colleagues, if they have any ideas that have arisen out of our workshop today, that they can kindly share them for our future events. I think we can do many things together. I mean, a couple of speakers that I would like to be in touch directly to discuss some projects. Again, I would like to thank you, Alex, and all your team for this wonderful work and for this opportunity to have a real professional partnership on a very noble issue, as I said in the beginning, on fighting corruption on one hand and preserving our planet on the other hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, distinguished participants and panelists, thank you very much for the time you have given us today. We wish you the best. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.